not only should the contract be in existence, but even your actions should lean more into who you are. Are you an employee or you are a consultant? If it's a consultancy, have that consultancy agreement drafted by a proper lawyer that has knowledge of the tests that are available. What's the distinction between an employee and a consultant?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 2 of the Tax Hub podcast. My name is Edwin Michael Echiba. I'm a lawyer and a tax consultant. I currently work with BDO East Africa, and I'm very privileged to be your moderator this afternoon. And joining me on episode 2 of the Tax Hub podcast is a distinguished panel comprised of eminent tax practitioners. To my right is Miss Vanessa Mbekeka Muneza. Vanessa, you're very welcome to the Tax Hub podcast.
Thank you, Edwin.
All right, Vanessa, to our viewers out there, they would like to know who is Vanessa that is going to be speaking to us?
Yes, Mbekeka Vanessa Irene Muneza. I'm an advocate, a tax practitioner, currently working at AF Mpanga Advocates in the tax department.
All right, thank you, Vanessa. We're very delighted to have you this afternoon, and we look forward to a very fruitful deliberation. To my far right is a gentleman who needs no introduction, very distinguished and eminent tax practitioner. Mr. Birungi Cephas, you're very welcome to the Tax Hub podcast.
Thank you, Edwin. Thank you for inviting me to the second episode of the Tax Hub podcast. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you very much. To those who don't know Mr. Birungi, I don't have the experience to even introduce him. So allow him to just give us a brief of who is Mr. Birungi for the benefit of our viewers out there.
Thank you, Edwin, once again. Birungi Cephas is a tax practitioner. He's also a managing partner of Birungi Barata and Associates, a law firm in Kampala.
Thank you very much, Mr. Birungi. We're very honored to have you. It's always good of you to share your vast experience and knowledge. Ladies and gentlemen, episode 2 of the Tax Hub podcast is still bringing you very pertinent, very practical, and very candid tax discussions. On episode 2, we are going to center our discussion around the High Court ruling in the case of Infectious Diseases Institute versus URA, a very fundamental ruling that also clarified on very many trivial issues around the consultancy space, particularly independent consultants, whether or not they should be classified as employees. Where do you draw the divide? A very, very fundamental ruling that speaks to very many business arrangements. So it's very good of us to just take a deep dive and have a very candid discussion around this case, how it affects you, how it impacts you, but most importantly, are there any take-homes, any policy considerations, any reforms we can suggest? So Vanessa and Mr. Birungi are joining me to deliberate and discuss that. And the important thing is we're also very privileged to have the tax lawyer that argued this matter before the High Court. So Vanessa was part of the team that argued the matter before the High Court. And congratulations on winning a very fundamental ruling. So I just want to start with you, Miss Vanessa. Miss Vanessa, just walk us through why should someone care to know a thing or two about the Infectious Diseases Institute versus the URA matter. Walk us through what were the facts, where was URA coming from, what was in issue. Very good for our viewers just to follow us on this journey.
Thank you, Edwin. One, I'll start with why it's important. Majority of the people in the formal sector are either employees or consultants. So it's very important to draw a distinction between who an employee is and who an independent consultant is. So for purposes of this case that we are discussing today, Infectious Diseases Institute is a company limited by guarantee that specializes in doing research on infectious diseases. So the issue at hand was IDI, I'll abbreviate it, hired a number of professionals that assisted in doing the research. So when URA came up and carried out a comprehensive audit, the biggest issue that we're dealing with at hand was the issue of why they did not declare pay as you earn for these private consultants. So obviously they went through the objection process, the objection was disallowed, and an assessment of about 185 million was maintained. and taken to the Tax Appeals Tribunal. So unfortunately for IDI, the Tax Appeals Tribunal made a ruling that upheld this tax assessment, stating that they actually were employees within the confines of Section 2Z of the Income Tax Act that says a person who earns a fixed and ascertainable income is an employee. Of course, arguments went back and forth from the applicant and the respondent, but subsequently, because the decision was made, being dissatisfied, we proceeded to the High Court, wherein we laid grounds for appeal, about 3 grounds that were raised regarding, 1, the tribunal's decision on what amounted to an employee within the confines of Section 2Z, So what we saw from that is the tribunal created an interpretation that was not originally in the law. So what Section 2 is simply saying is 2Z is defining who amounts to an employee, a director, if it's a person who is entitled to fixed ascertainable remuneration, someone in a public servant, among others. So for the tribunal finding that when someone earns a fixed and ascertainable remuneration for 2 months or more makes them an employee was actually a wrong conclusion. And then the second ground of appeal was the tribunal misapplied the principles. When it comes to determining who an employee is, there are different tests that have to be applied. The control test, the integral test, so it applied this test wrongly and hence a ground for appeal. And lastly, the failure of the tribunal to evaluate the evidence that was presented before it. So the applicant presented all the consultancy contracts that were available to it for the professionals that were doing this research on those infectious diseases, but the tribunal still found in favor of the respondent. So what we see in the tribunal is the tribunal gets down into analyzing the biggest issue being statutory interpretation. The appellant argued that the tribunal took on the power to become legislators by imposing a requirement that if a person earns a fixed and ascertainable remuneration for more than two months, they're an employee, which we actually felt was a very wrong principle. So what the High Court does is digress into that. What is the role of the tribunal in interpreting statutes and not taking the role of being a legislator? So we've all understand the primary principle is tax has to be imposed, through a statute. And the law providing for that taxation should be clear and unambiguous. And of course, if it's ambiguous, which was one of the arguments that was raised, then it should be interpreted in the favor of the taxpayer. But in this case, it's technically not ambiguous. When it comes to employees, we're looking at the primary law that governs the relationship between an employer and an employee, being the Employment Act. The Employment Act vividly defines who amounts to an employee and it governs that relationship. However, when it comes to a consultant, it's quite different. There are different tests that you apply and say this person is a consultant, this person is an employee. So what the High Court found was that was a wrong interpretation of the law to say that if a person earns a fixed and ascertainable remuneration for a period of 2 months, that is actually not the right thing. Instead, there has to be a certain degree of permanency. What does permanency mean? That there should be a contract that's governing an entitlement. For example, if the Employment Act provides for an employee is entitled to remuneration, an employee is entitled to leave days, an employee is entitled to sick leave, to sick pay. There are so many benefits that the Employment Act provides for, which is quite different from the relationship between a consultant and their employer, I would say. Technically, not an employer, but yes, a consultant and their person who is actually paying them. So we go ahead to see that there are different parameters that must be applied. No single test is good enough to say that because someone comes to a lab and performs different tests, because there's equipment provided, I'm having control, I'm providing the tools, you're integral to my business. Whereas IDEA, I guess, does research, but no single test is good enough. And precedent has come over time to say that not one single test is good enough to say that this amounts to an employment relationship. So all in all, the law cannot be interpreted in a void. the different laws that have to be harmonized, and still it would not create an ambiguity. So when it comes to what are the implications of that, when it comes to consultants or employees, is there has to be a strict distinction. There has to be a contract of employment laying down what you're entitled to, what your obligations are vis-a-vis a consultancy agreement.
Thank you very much, Miss Vanessa. Vanessa has given us a very good recital to what the dispute before the High Court was, and she has given the background of where we're coming from, what was URA's view, but most importantly, what was the taxpayer arguing before the High Court, and equally before the Tax Appeals Tribunal. So I want to bring in Mr. Birungi. Mr. Birungi, we've had the spirited argument for the appellant as well as the respondent, the Uganda Revenue Authority. After court determining arguments of either sides, what was court's position? For the benefit of that viewer out there who has not read the case, what was court's determination in this groundbreaking decision?
Thank you, Edwin. I think it's important to understand or to know that Justice Ochaya wrote his decision in 38 pages. First of all, 38 pages, kind of a Supreme Court decision. So he really took time to analyze a lot of things. He went into detail about interpretation of statutes, but most important of all, he made the table on page 30 where he tried to give what he thinks are the tests which should be applied. And I read them slowly. 1 is the control of work test. 2 is the place of work test. 3 is the pay test. 4 is tools of work test. The next is integration of work test. Other engagements, benefits, and integration. In other words, he went through so many cases to identify which are the common areas that can be used to determine who is a consultant and who is not. But even after laying out all these tests, he said none of them alone can determine who is an employee. Not even a combination of a few of them would be enough. But what you find is that this decision highlights, clarifies, amplifies on what was a very restrictive decision of the Tax Appeals Tribunal. So in other words, it is a good test to be used by other judges. The challenge will be how will the legislator use these tests and say, combine these or identify these or find out which of these is the overriding test that can then shift the balance to the other. But it's a good development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Birungi. Mr. Birungi has given us insights of what the decision of the High Court was. And I think it's very important for all of us to take the time to read the decision in its entirety. All right. I just want to bring in Vanessa. Vanessa, I want to pick your mind on a very important point that was subject of appeal, particularly on the tribunal's position that anyone who is in employment and who is being remunerated and has a fixed remuneration for a period exceeding 2 months will definitely be classified as an employee. I just want to pick your mind on that. What was the High Court's determination on that, particularly on that principle?
So the High Court's determination on that was that's not what the law provides for. Yeah. Section 2Z is very clear. It says a fixed and ascertainable remuneration. And the High Court emphasized that there has to be a certain level, a degree of permanency, basically, that is derived from a contract between an employer and employee. Now, you see, when it comes to consultants, you're not certain that at the end of the month, I'm going to be entitled to this amount of money unless you've done the work, which is quite different for an employee. An employee could come to work 30 days a month and maybe work 15 days, depending, yeah? And they'll still be entitled to their full remuneration, unlike a consultant. If a consultant has not met their KPIs for that given period of time, they're not entitled to be remunerated for the work not done. So, and then also the High Court went to also emphasize that the issue of, just to pick up on what my colleague Cephas mentioned, that employment vis-a-vis consultancy is a question of fact. It might not be a question. Okay, the law comes in to apply to the facts, but it's a factual situation, and it's on a case by case basis. You have to review the facts surrounding that situation. For example, if someone is a consultant, maybe they have the tools, like you mentioned, there are several tests, and not one or several combined could satisfy. So in this case specifically, you find that when you look at the contracts that were provided by IDI, they clearly demonstrated that this person is a consultant. The IDI was required to withhold 6%, and they had the obligation to remit the balance, right? They definitely had no entitlement to NSSF. They had no entitlement. They had no work hours, but just had to make sure that they get their work done. How they do it was really up to them. And in this case, what was also provided in the tribunal was an HR manual that provides for the relationship between the employer and the employees. They're entitled to NSSF, they have sick days, they have basically all the benefits that employees have as provided for under the Employment Act, which is quite different from what these consultants were entitled to. So that important test in this case was some degree of permanency should exist, yeah? And the fact that there's no single test to determine who an employee is, and it's on a case-to-case factual basis. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Vanessa, for that wonderful insight. Just to add, I think the ruling was very timely. At the time the ruling came out, the Uganda Revenue Authority had undertaken a project where they were seeking to analyze very many businesses that use a similar arrangement where they have independent consultants, and very many of them were reclassified. URSV was all these employees. And I think one critical sector that was largely impacted was the medical sector. There was an audit on very many hospitals where they sought to reclassify the specialist doctors as employees. And this was very, very impactful to the entire industry. And I think we saw different engagements in different fora, which then became very pertinent. So we're just building up on the importance of this ruling. So it didn't only affect IDI, but it affected very many consultants, very many business arrangements where they seek to rely on independent consultants as opposed to employees. So I just want to bring it back to Vanessa. Vanessa, now that we're seeing the decision of the High Court, we're seeing the High Court coming in to clarify, amplify, and rectify some of the aspects that were missed by the Tax Appeal Tribunal. What should an employer out those ends, what should a business owner out those ends take note of? In other words, what are the implications of some of these decisions out those ends? Is it just impacting IDI? Is it just impacting people in the medical sector? What should the general public out those ends take note of in light of the IDI ruling?
So one, it's very important to distinguish the obligations under an employment contract vis-a-vis a consultancy agreement. So under consultancy, the person paying needs to withhold 6%. Say in this case, it's a professional service, yeah? Then under the employment contract, 30 to 40%, depending on how well you earn. And that 30% is collected by the employer, failure of which the employer will be liable for that tax. Same as withholding tax. If you don't withhold from a professional, you will be the one who will have to pay that tax. So the concept behind that is if I withhold 6%, I'm believing that the consultant is going to remit the 24% and use that 6% as a credit as they're filing their individual tax returns. So that should be the first distinction. So when it comes to employers that engage both employees and consultants, the biggest issue with tax matters is documentation. Getting that arrangement on paper, yeah? If you're an employee, what are the terms of your employment contract? Lay them down clearly, and not only should the contract be in existence, but even your actions should lean more into who you are. Are you an employee or you are a consultant? If it's a consultancy, have that consultancy agreement drafted by a proper lawyer that has knowledge of the tests that are available. What's the distinction between an employee and a consultant? I know usually people in business or employers might not see the relevance. They usually come at the tail end when things have gone south, that, oh, I have this problem, but when you're asking, where's the documentation? It seems more that this person was not a consultant, but an employee. So having the two align, an employee align with their contract, a consultant also align with the kind of roles that he's assigned. So on that front, it's important for people to, one, understand the obligations. Secondly, they need to also put this down into writing. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. She makes very interesting take homes. Your documentation should speak to the particular arrangement you're having. So I just want to bring in Mr. Birungi. Mr. Birungi, do you agree this was a very fundamental ruling? And if you do, what are some of those implications this ruling will have across the consultancy business?
Thank you, Edwin. Definitely, this is a very important decision. But it informs one or two things. One, when you read this decision, it refers to another case of APA insurance, where a group of insurance agents and insurance brokers had a dispute with the URA, almost the same thing. The URA was categorizing the agents as employees, and the agents were saying, we are not employees, we are independent practitioners, we are consultants to the insurance industry. This is a fairly old decision, I think 8 years back. URA didn't take heed of that. They didn't make any practice notice. They didn't make any adjustments anywhere. And I believe, other than relaxing on the move they were making on the audit of the medical institutions, nothing much is being done. No clarity is coming out. But I suspect that they are regrouping. The whole idea, as Vanessa said, is that consultants or independent contractors should pay the rightful amount of tax and not just pay the 6%. URA, by getting the 6%, is getting information on those consultants. It should on its own follow them up so that those persons file their returns. It should not be punishing the employers. By trying to end at the point of the employer they are not actually employers, and just such as I said, they had a problem with what to call those people, since they couldn't call them employees or consultants without appearing to bias. Now the other ones who were sued, I don't know now which term to call them, the IDI equivalents, because if I call them employers, then again I'm categorizing it as an employer relationship. But I guess you know what I mean. The ones who pay shouldn't be punished. The ones who are deducting the 6% should not be punished to pay the 30% or 40%, because they have very little control over those persons. And if you go to the medical field, you'll find that there are certain consultants, or there were certain consultants at one time, at least for me when I was still, many years back, when I was in employment too. There were about 30 doctors or less. You'd find that there are only about 5 cardiologists who were moving around all these major hospitals. Clearly, everybody knew that Dr. Dabera is a cardiologist, although he goes to Zambia, he goes to Rubaga, he goes to wherever. Dr. Sekazamba is an expert in this. So you know that he goes to all of them, but you just pick where you found him and say, no, this is an employee. So look for the person, let that person file their tax returns, but don't punish the patients, because if you actually insist that this person is going to be taxed at Case Hospital where you have found him, then you are going to make Case Hospital drop that person, and the patients who are going there are going to suffer in that process. You are driving the economy underground. So you'd rather actually capture these persons wherever they were, and that's the point we're making in the insurance case. These people are independent. Make them file their returns like the way you make a shopkeeper file his or her returns. Don't make the end payer the sufferer. So that is the point we are saying. But it is important for those same consultants to know that URA is regrouping to get them now in a different capacity.
Yes, so just to add to that, it's actually interesting, but I believe the URA saw the hospitals as a low-hanging fruit because withholding tax is supposed to be a mode of collection. Technically, it's not a tax. It's basically the person who is compliant saying, I understand my obligations and I'm going to withhold and remit the same to URA. So URA should use that information to, like you said, go after the individual. I know there are so many doctors out there, but majority of them might not even know their obligations. Yeah. Has the URA taken time to educate these people and tell them these are your obligations, what you're supposed to do? Most of them will see their argument saying withholding tax of 6%, or maybe they'll want to negotiate it. Yeah, but it's fixed and it's the law. You're supposed to pay that tax. But on the other end, they might not be remitting. So for me, I think it was just a low-hanging fruit to say, let's go after the industry. But the impact of this is if hospitals have to remit 30 to 40%, yeah, pay as you earn. Number one, it's going to make medical services really expensive. Yeah. We all have a right to medical care. Yeah. It's literally lifelines on the line. If now consultancy of a doctor, let's say in Nakasero Hospital was charging, let's say 60,000, and I have to, considering my cash flow issues, I'm going to have to increase the consultancy fee, because now instead of saying I'm going to pay this doctor, let's say 10 million, and I have to make a certain deduction of now 40%, because technically 10 million a month, you in the next bracket. Yeah. It makes medical services really expensive, which is also driving the medical industry down to the ground, and it's an essential necessity. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. I think we all agree this decision does not only impact the medical space. Mr. Birungi just confirmed to us those in the insurance sector. It cuts across anyone who's in consultancy business. It's very pertinent of you to take regard to this decision, and at least you have some work to do. Restructure, look around how you structure your contracts, pay regard to the terms, but also most importantly, look at the nature of your relationship, how you carry on, because just like Mr. Birungi says, the URA is not sleeping. They're regrouping, and we hope they do not catch you at the next round. But just to confirm, now that URA is regrouping, Vanessa, I want to raise a very important question to you. You handled the matter at the High Court and you won at the High Court. We just want to confirm, are you aware, has the URA appealed this decision? Is there an appeal? Or is it that the taxpayers should go home and celebrate?
As far as I'm concerned, I'm not aware of any appeal. At least we've not been served any. But we're also aware that the URA has majorly dropped a couple of assessments that were going across the industry. So maybe that's a good sign. Yeah. At least they are heeding to what the High Court has interpreted as who should be a consultant and who should be an employee.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, for that confirmation. Certainly, Justice Ochaya's 38 pages have not gone in vain. At least we see that the URA is seeking to implement some of the good guidance he has in there. So this then brings us to a very important discussion. I know we could have touched briefly on it, but it's very important to guide our dear taxpayers out there. It's very important to guide the general public, the employers. So from a policy perspective, from a take-home perspective, what are some of the recommendations you would give not only to the taxpayers, not only to the employers, but it could even be to the Uganda Revenue Authority, to our policymakers, the Ministry of Finance, to our lawmakers. So it's very good to have a take-home. It's very good for us to generate recommendations that can better our practice, better the business. So I just want to start with Vanessa. Vanessa, what are some of those policy considerations you can suggest across board?
One, stakeholder management meetings. So I wouldn't say I'm very familiar with the medical industry, which is what I believe the people who legislate are in the same position. So have these meetings with these medical practitioners. Understand. So if one doctor works at 10 hospitals, yeah, what's the best way forward? How should they account for their taxes? Do promote awareness. Yeah, let people understand their tax obligations so that they're able to comply and avoid future penalties. Yeah, I believe those are the recommendations I have.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. I think that confirms a discussion that very many taxpayers were saying. The hospitals were saying, no, it's the doctors that should take regard and should pay this tax. So the doctors are saying, oh, I'm not even aware of some of the taxes. So URA, I think if they care to just sit down with these doctors, have trainings for them, take them through what is required of them, they will certainly comply. But the non-compliance should not be vested on the hospitals. So I just want to bring in Mr. Birungi. Mr. Birungi, what are some of the recommendations you can suggest across board, be it to the policymakers, be it to the lawmakers, be it to the Uganda Revenue Authority, or generally to the people in the consultancy space?
Thank you, Edwin. First of all, by saying URA is regrouping and Vanessa confirming they didn't appear, I shouldn't appear like I'm encouraging them to do anything else on that matter. They should drop it. I shouldn't be misunderstood. But the problem, I think, is multifaceted. First of all, we have moved a long way to have the withholding tax on these individuals being accepted as it is. But it's also important to understand that a tax of 40% is extremely high. That's why you find many people in Uganda saying the few who are complying are being overtaxed. When you look at the structure of the taxes, the employees, of course, are the lowest hanging fruits. They are the easiest to catch. They have no option in the matter. The employers are the ones who have to pay to collect from them. There's no negotiation. Very many others find there's a leverage. There are expenses, deductibles, which can mitigate the tax. But a tax of 40% is extremely high in countries where there are such rates. Very many services are clearly available, and they don't have what we call the African tax. You know what it means, African tax. You earn you are 10 million, but you have 20 dependents who will take it away. If you are in Sweden, you earn your 10 million, it's your 10 million. And you know that you'll catch a train at a minimum cost. If you are a certain age, you'll not pay. And you have a very small family. But here, you have a 40% tax. And here, you have a situation where, ironically, all the judges have already exempted themselves from tax. You are aware, they first won a case which to the effect that judicial officers shouldn't pay tax. Then the legislature confirmed it. Then they now went to the parliament and said they will be paid forever. So whatever they are getting, now we are getting to a situation of having 200 judges. And it is my case that Uganda should have about 2,000 judges, because if we are looking at having 10,000 doctors, why should we not have 10,000 judges? It's the same kind of work. So if we had actually 10,000 judges, all of whom don't pay tax and have these benefits, where is the basket from which they are going to be paid? I'm aware the permanent secretaries have now come and been exempted. The DPP's office was exempted 2 years back. Mm-hmm. So we are getting tax increased on those who are left, and you are getting increasingly more and more people getting exemptions. And those who are left paying 40%. So it's going to be a challenge even to get those who can pay 40% to keep complying. So we would rather have reduced rates over a bigger scope, over a bigger catchment point. If you read Onyango Bo's article yesterday in the Monitor, he was saying, I would advocate for a 5% tax rate across the board for most people. Maybe it's extreme, but if you look at having to pay 40% of your income in a country where you really have to do so many things for yourself, you'll find you need a lot of patriotism to be compliant, especially when you find that the leaders who are supposed to be patriotic have exempted themselves. Parliament has exempted itself. Judges have exempted themselves. I don't know whether the executives need any exemption. Maybe they don't. So who is left? You are telling the rest of the people, bear the burden. We don't care. The revenue guys will catch you. So I think the policymakers should really make tax much more affordable.
Thank you very much, Mr. Birungi. Mr. Birungi makes a very, very kind appeal to the policymakers, the lawmakers. Let's sit down, have a very keen review of the tax policy perspective, mostly around the exemptions we're granting. Why should some sectors be granted exemptions whereas others are paying? But yes, Mr. Brunji, thank you very much. Those are some of the recommendations and policy reforms we're generating, and we believe at some point they'll be considered. But thank you very much. And I think what we're getting from both Vanessa and Mr. Birunji is you will have to comply. In absence of the exemption, comply. If you are someone doing business, go ahead and file your returns, pay your rightful taxes. Then also the other that we're getting is be very mindful of the arrangement that you're getting into. If it's strictly a consultancy, make sure your contracting speaks in that regard. If it's employment, have that clarity, because the URA will review these contracts and these agreements that you're entering into. And I think those are also very, very pertinent points. Ladies and gentlemen, the discussion is carrying on. We can't exhaust it in here. Very fundamental decision, but at least we're happy to hear from Vanessa that the URA has not appealed. So we take it that it's a closed case, unless, like Mr. Birunji says, there could be regrouping. So we are on the look. But yeah, the discussion at the Tax Hub will carry on. Episode 2 will be coming to a close, but this discussion is something that we're not closing over here. We are picking it up, carrying it with the rightful people, the policymakers, the lawmakers, the different professional bodies that are involved, the Law Society, the ICPAU. That's a discussion we're going to keep carrying on so that we can effectively guide our general public out those ends. So from all of us at the Tax Hub, we want to express our gratitude. Firstly, to Mr. Birunji, we're very, very thankful for making the time to sit down with us this afternoon, share your vast knowledge, your vast experience. Very kind of you, and we're very, very grateful, and we look forward to having you in our subsequent episodes. We're very grateful to Mr. Birunji and the team at...
I'm very grateful to you, Edwin, and the Tax Hub.
Thank you very much. And we're also equally grateful to the team at Birunji Barata and Associates, the breeder team. And to the lady in red to my right, Miss Vanessa, we're equally very grateful for having you share your experience at the High Court, your experience at the Tax Appeals Tribunal, but most importantly, guiding the general public what they should take regard to and how the URA is on the look. So Vanessa Bekeka from AF Mpanga, we're equally very grateful to have you, and we look forward to having you in our subsequent episodes.
A pleasure is all mine.
Ladies and gentlemen, the podcast could not be brought without our other partners, notably Onomo Hotel. We're very grateful. They are hosting the Tax Hub podcast, so we're equally grateful to Onomo Hotel and all our other partners, AF Mpanga, Birunji Barata and Associates. Thank you. Episode 3 of the Tax Hub podcast is coming out. Follow our YouTube channel, like, hit that notification, and stay on the look for episode 3, where we continue to discuss, deliberate, and pick up on topical issues that are very, very pertinent